Garrett, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me, Dan.
Yeah, of course. So there's so many places that we could get into regarding the intersection of software and this agency world of ours. But I guess maybe a good first question is what's impressing you nowadays? Where are you most excited? Where are you seeing innovation in that area?
Yeah, I just think it's really interesting in terms of the way consumers' behaviors are changing. And so there's a lot going on right now in the e-commerce world, making it easier than ever for businesses to get going and getting their products up online. So I'm seeing a lot of cool tools around that. And then naturally around remote work, you're seeing a lot of really innovative businesses, naturally the Zoom boom, if you will, but also companies kind of building the tools for communication to make online communication that much more effective. So it's been the last few months with all the negatives out there. There's been some really interesting positives too.
Yeah, that's cool. There's so much to get into. I guess starting with the e-commerce angle, what's going on there? Like, what does that software look like? Can you dig into that a little bit more about how you're kind of seeing the software meld with the way consumer habits are changing?
Yeah, so it's just the way you can get your voice out there and be amplified in e-commerce. So there's naturally the desire to bring people to your home base, whether that's through Shopify or BigCommerce just went into their IPO recently. And so they're building out a lot of tools to bring people to your website and kind of develop the shopping cart to make it as efficient as possible.
Hmm.
Making sure that giving you the tools to not lose customers along the way. I think the average person, you don't think about, why someone adds something to a cart and then ultimately doesn't get through the entire process, like doesn't put their credit card information in or doesn't ultimately, decide on the shipping. What are these different kind of barriers? And so, whether it's actual, drop shipping and fulfillment tools or ultimately, making the process as frictionless as possible, I feel like those sort of interfaces are becoming much more effective. Shopify has been improving, developing their own marketplace. And then the other side of that is these marketplaces. So, you see recently a Shopify Facebook collaboration. Amazon continues to build out all of the tools they make for retailers to effectively get in front of the eyes of their customers. Online reviews are becoming that much more important. And so there's a lot of ways for businesses to surface competitor information and research in terms of improving their own listings. So, you're seeing tools that are making it easier to see how you do against competitors in terms of rankings on product sites as well as review sites. So it's all over the place, to your point.
Yeah, that's interesting. And things being all over the place in terms of the software. I guess like what I'm curious about is like, there's a couple different paths. Like, do we get to a place where agencies have less utility because the software is so good and that anybody selling anything can just, plug something into an algorithm and then it spits out money for them? Or is it the flip side? Is it the fact, or is the software more abundant and more complex and there's much more of it, many more players, thus substantiating the need for an agency and an expert? So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of different models that we're going to continue to see evolve for the agency. Naturally, there's the done for you kind of setup model where the agency is coming in, they're setting up all of the processes. I know it's sales schema. This is a big thing where it's like, making sure the processes are in place so a business can be successful and then let the business run wild and then kind of be available on a consultative level. And then there's the agency model where they still do want to do everything for you. Some of the more sophisticated tools, their goal isn't necessarily to dumb it down and make it too easy. They are so robust and they require kind of a certain amount of human intelligence to use them properly. And so I think the agency will always have that role if they know those tools inside and out to
Mhm.
effectively use it on behalf of the client who, if it's a business owner, they probably have a ton of other responsibilities. Marketing and sales might not be their top of mind. They might be focusing on product development. So there's always going to be a role for agency. I just think the role of the agency and their relationship with their clients potentially could change.
Yeah, yeah, and let's dig into that a little bit more. Like, in what ways do you see it changing, that relationship, over the next X months or years?
Right. So I think, ultimately the metrics are becoming more and more transparent when you're kind of showing the bottom line of the value of the agency. I think there's going to be a more responsibility for the agency to show where the budget of the client is going. Um, Sometimes it's scary because there are a lot of factors that are outside of our control, but there's so many different tactics that an agency can use to effectively deliver the bottom line, which is identifying, sales, revenue, average order value, kind of the higher KPIs that lead to those bottom of the funnel ones, which is, traffic and email subscribers. And so I feel like agencies are going to be responsible to report to clients, where the clients might not necessarily continue to want to get into the nitty gritty, but they'll want to know that the value is being delivered to their business, and the tools are there to show that more effectively.
Yeah, yeah, and that's where I've always been, and I guess not skeptical, but maybe a little skeptical of the ability of the tools to actually give you a full map of what's happening. It's sort of like how the map is not the territory, where I think that this isn't a slight on anybody's various tool, but I think that there's a lot of these tools that are sort of built on telling stories, that may or may not be the reality. And there's sometimes like this overconfidence. Like, for example, it's really hard there's just so many intangibles, and then sometimes the feedback loop is so long. But you'll have these tools that, and in my world, it's email campaigns and sales campaigns, and they'll say you got this open rate or this response rate, and I just know that there's just not enough data yet, and it's not it's not going to be a realistic picture of what's going on. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. Like, it's kind of a meandering question, but just what how you guys think about telling stories in the right way based on the data you have, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, I think that's the hardest problem for marketers, is attribution, right? Because it's not a one-to-one. I think that clients want to know, okay, I got this many sales from this one channel.
Right.
But the way the customer interacts with a brand is so different. And so we're going to see, that's going to be interesting to watch as these tools evolve, to identify what is the best model for attribution. Is it going to be, not just first click, not just last click? It's where and how do you value each of these points along the way? For instance, if someone sees your brand via an advertising, an ad on Google, and then they read a blog post, and then they see you on Twitter, and then they hear someone, mention you on your podcast. How do we value each of those touch points along the journey? And how does that ultimately impact where we spend our marketing and budget dollars? And there's a sophistication there that we're not there yet. And I don't know how quickly we'll get there, because it might be tailored differently for each individual business. You have to know your audience, which is still a challenge, and know where your audience is existing. One tool specifically that's really cool that's come out is Sparkturo, which is Rand Fishkin's recent SaaS tool that helps you identify the interests of your audiences. So basically, the tool allows you to put in your domain and then identify who your visitors are, and then what podcasts they're into, what blogs they read, where they are online, social media channels, and that helps inform our marketing strategy. But I think it's a responsibility of the agency, potentially, to identify what advertising, what content marketing, what outreach that you should invest in, how valuable it is to the bottom line, and how you offer that to the client. So, going back to the KPIs, what's the most bang for your buck?
Right. And I think that there's there's just so much to sift through that I guess I wonder, like, what let me back up a bit. It almost seems like there's certain situations where the data is overwhelming, where there's like, a firm or an agency that's dealing with like a fire hose of consumer data, and they can directly attribute something very easily. And then there's other areas where it's you could see how there could be aberrations, caused by this or that. So you're ascribing like X dollar amount to Twitter or like Facebook ads or whatever. And it's hard to say. But I guess to flip this a little bit, and go a little more positive on technology. You're working with agencies all the time. Traject has all sorts of very useful products, presumably for agencies. So I'd love to hear what are those blind spots that you see. Are there places where you see agencies kind of beating their head against the wall, where you're like, if they just had this piece of software, whether it's from you guys or someone else, what are those areas that tend to come up, if any?
Yeah, I think that, to your point, it's easy to be a chicken with your head cut off. And with agencies, I think when you try to be everything to everyone, that's a potential risk. I mean, like we're talking about with, the nuances between each individual business, it's hard to have like a cookie cutter box that works for everyone. So I find that the most effective agencies are the ones who really know who they are. And that could be a focus on a specific service, a specific industry, a specific customer type. And I think agencies get scared that they're locking themselves in and that they're not going to have enough prospects or enough clients to, be able to service and keep themselves afloat. And I think that's a valid concern. I think that agencies need to think more about their own positioning and starting small, and then you can always expand, right? You're never locked in. You can always reestablish yourself, reinvent yourself, or just add offerings in a regimented, kind of iterative way, the same way that we think about SaaS products. And there are tools that allow you to offer those services more effectively. Yeah. And so I think that's the key is doing your due diligence in evaluating how you're going to use your tools on behalf of your clients. Are those software tools allowing you to scale and be able to serve more clients, or does it help you serve your smaller client roster more effectively?
Yeah, and I'm so glad you said that, because that's obviously something that we're always harping about and beating our clients and others up about, as are many others. But I like that you said it, as opposed to saying, just here's a sweet tactical tool you can go pick up to solve all of your problems. Like, I think you seem to be seeing what we're seeing, which is that, everything is harder when you're all over the place. Everything's easier when you're focused. And what I'm constantly trying to figure out is, like, why is it so hard for agencies to, and I guess other industries too, but especially the agency world, like, why is it so hard to focus? And we talk to agencies where like 80-90% of their business is in one industry, and you go to their site and there's still just everything under the sun there, and I'm just like, why? Like, guys, like, why is this so hard? Like, why do you think it's so hard to specialize?
I think, it's almost, I almost liken it to giving therapy. For some reason, we're so good as humans to give advice to other people, but we're really bad at giving advice to ourselves. And I feel like so often we can work with our clients and we can identify their problem because it's this other situation. It's something separate. And you can, look at it from a completely different perspective than when we look at ourselves. And I think with agencies, that's the issue, is there's not enough time spent really reflecting on the message you're putting out and how you can give advice to yourself and then implement what advice you give to other clients. Like, if anything, you almost should reach out to another agency to kind of audit your own website so you can get out of your own head and get someone else's advice that you could then implement, because the implementation, you're going to execute it well. It's just really hard to look at yourself objectively. And so I feel like agencies don't do that enough. They don't look at their own website. They can't look at it with fresh eyes. You need to get outside opinions from other experts to understand, how you're positioning yourself.
Right, right. That makes sense. And to shift gears a little bit, I'd love to talk about your role at Traject. I think like your role specifically is interesting, but also just the model in which your role kind of lives now, where you have a head of content and you have essentially somebody like Rand Fission's kind of doing a similar thing, where it's almost like the athlete model. Like you could probably build a following and then take it on the road to some other team if you wanted to. I'm not saying that should or will happen, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. Like, to me, that model is super cool. Like Joe Rogan's like that a little bit on the highest level, making 100 million for doubling down on Spotify. I'd love to hear your thought, like if you agree that model does exist and where you might think it's going. Does that make sense?
It's interesting. I personally just geek out on marketing. It's like when you visit my podcast, it's just like fun to talk about tech and talk about digital marketing, the different ways that you can get online. I think we live in an influencer culture, and it's a double-edged sword, because I think on the one hand, it's easier to get your voice out there and get it amplified. On the other hand, there's this problem where practitioners are more theory and less execution. And I think that when it comes to being an in-house role for a content creator, there's not enough time in the day. So you really have to allocate your time effectively between, focusing on your own professional branding and how that impacts your brand, and then also how you invest in your own branding and the actual execution time, especially when, most of us, we are a smaller team. I wish I could say that I had 30 marketers that I was working on with content across, the 6 brands under Traject that we're working with. But, we're a small team. And so we want to make the most of our time and provide great content and education around the various, marketing disciplines that our software tools cover. But at the same time, people don't trust brands as much as they trust individuals. And right. So it is kind of essential in that job of, attracting customers, attracting prospects, to have, kind of the representative, whether it's the head of content or a CEO or a VP of marketing or, just a content creator. It's a win-win, right? Because not only are you, helping the brand, because that's just the way that people interact online with brands these days, but you are beneficiary of your own professional development and becoming someone visible in your industry.
Right. And do you think it's like a little bit of an illusion that there even is any loyalty to a brand? I mean, that's the wrong way to put it. Obviously, there's loyalty to brands, but that the brand even exists in a way, because all the like I think that, what was it? You all know Harari was writing about this, where if you can't really figure out where a company exists, like you could say it's the people can get fired or move around. You could say it's the products can change or be destroyed or whatever. You could say it's the supplies, the holdings, but it's never any of these things, the shareholders. So I guess do you see the sort of B2B influencer thing just, becoming, I guess, a better reality of what's happening, where this loyalty that's perceived towards a company is actually, because in reality, people probably like hearing you. They like hearing your interviews. It's interesting. Whether there's this or that product behind it is sort of like advertising. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it is kind of a tricky situation, because every company I worked with in the past, I'm lucky to have worked with these companies, want to grow and invest in their employees. Like, they want their employees to succeed, but at some point, in order for the employees to grow, they need to be able to spread their wings elsewhere. Right. And so I think a lot of it has to do with any type of executive sort of team, in how you're building the culture of your company, and that you never want to be fully dependent on a set of individuals within the company. You want to have the processes in place that you could then, grow the next, to go back to your sports analogy, it's kind of like, building a sports team where, everyone ages and, at some point people are going to go on elsewhere. But if you have the right programs in place and you're always, kind of nurturing and growing your internal talent, it's not going to be the end of the world when those professionals do leave to pursue whatever their goals are ultimately. And so it also requires you to pick the right people who have the emotional intelligence where those relationships don't end after they leave. It's not as direct a relationship, but you're always going to be working together as long as bridges aren't burned and you're supportive of one another. I don't think it has to be negative, but it is tricky because I don't think people want to stay in the same position forever anymore. That's just not how careers work.
Right. And that's where I tend to go kind of like Silicon Valley utopian in my head, where it's like, oh, this seems cool. Like the idea of, it's called the gig economy, but I think it's more interesting and compelling than just gigs. I think it could be much longer term than you'd perceive a gig, but it's not the idea. Like, I feel like we've been stuck in this, early industrial age concept where you're like with a company for 30 years. And even though everyone knows that's over, we still haven't like graduated to the next step of people being kind of their own entities and then bouncing around and doing interesting projects like the A-Team did or something, or like Schwarzenegger and Carl Weathers. Or
No, absolutely. Well, they all came back for the Expendables anyway. But
Expendables, right?
So relevant to the agency world, right? Because it's that much easier when you're kind of grooming a junior employee and they're moving up, and you either get to the point where you bring them in as a partner if they earn that, or they're going off and they're starting their own agency. And as you move towards the top of an agency, if you're becoming this professional B2B influencer, that is a way for you to generate leads. But if you're owning the agency, you're doing it for yourself. So maybe that's the best model, where it's like the ultimate goal is to become the owner of your own agency, and you're also the face of the agency, kind of bringing in the leads through your speaking engagements. But not everyone does that. I don't think that's necessarily attractive to every marketer out there. There are a lot of introverts who don't want to be in the spotlight.
Yeah. And I guess that kind of brings us maybe indirectly to the future of agencies and maybe like where things could be heading. And I wonder if there's going to be, more or fewer agencies in the next 5 years. Then maybe I'll leave that question at that and hear your thoughts on it.
Yeah, I think that, there are some of similar challenges and different challenges that agencies, face versus in-house practitioners, where the agency, going back to our initial discussion about specializing, there are different sized businesses that have different, budgets and resources and might not be able to specialize in a specific type of marketing. And so I think there's always going to be that value for an in-house team, as maybe not the biggest enterprises, but the biggest enterprises, outsource to the best agencies. So maybe that is the case, but there's always going to be that need of, if you don't have the in-house resources, to find a specialist. And that specialist could be the agency. And I don't think marketing the technology will become so sophisticated that it does the job for us. I think the cool thing about marketing in general and where agencies live is there's this intersection between creativity and kind of classical science, the metrics and the math and the, efficiencies versus the creativity that needs to grab attention and needs to be discovered and needs to build that brand awareness. I think those are, maybe it'll happen 20, 30, 50 years from now, but I think we're a ways away from that. And in the meantime, all you can do is continue to self-develop, specialize, and know who you're trying to build solutions for.
Yeah. And I'd love to talk a little bit more about creativity, because I think maybe I'm either nostalgic or just cynical right now or something, but it seems like I haven't seen, a campaign in a while that's like really wowed me. Like maybe it's just because when I was a kid, you were just more open to that, but I do feel like it could be because there's just less money being spent because of the economy, COVID, et cetera. It could be that things are a lot more politically correct now, and so agencies used to take more chances, in terms of humor and that sort of thing. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. Like, tell me I'm wrong if you think otherwise, or if there's stuff that you're seeing that's like, I'd love to hear like where the impressive creative stuff's going on. It's sort of like the mediums change, like in the 1800s, it was painting, and then it moved on to movies in the 20th century. Like maybe there's an area that I have a blind spot for where there is really cool stuff happening in advertising right now. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think the first problem is there's too much noise. There's too much media. It's hard to say it's one specific thing because we are responsible for curating our own bubbles, and we very much do that. And I think it's a kind of a two-way path where it's the responsibility of the consumer to decide what they're listening to, and then it's the responsibility for the brands to find the consumers who want them and get into their bubble, whether they're being discovered or not. So I think that when it comes to creative campaigns, I think social media is always going to be the source. Now, I'm hearing a theme now with a lot of practitioners where they'll try ideas out on social media, and then if it works, then they'll go hard. So, I think that there's opportunities in terms of just looking outside your bubble and just, following different brands. In terms of who's doing things most effectively, like just the other day, I saw Lemonade, which is an insurance company on the New York Stock Exchange, and they have the weirdest campaign. They just dip stuff in pink paint and it's this visual. And it's funny because it's like it doesn't even resonate what their message was to me. Like but I know, like I can visualize someone taking a random everyday object, dipping it in this pink paint, pulling it out, and I know they're an insurance company. So, like something worked with that. So I think there is still opportunities to do creative campaigns. I think you're right about the PC nature of, at least in the US, of politics. I think it's very polarized right now. And I think there's a lot of fear in choosing a side. One actual thing that I saw recently that I thought was really compelling was the Jason Fried and DHA who started this new email software, hey.com, which was going to be a Gmail competitor. They were also the founders of Basecamp, which is the project management tool. And their whole marketing campaign was picking a fight on social media channels about privacy. And so it's this whole idea about everything is polarized these days. Every issue is polarized. And so to be a contrarian and to pick a fight about something attracts a certain audience. And there's so many people in the world that if you pick the fight and you attract people who agree with you, that's a marketing strategy, right? And you're going to piss a lot of people off, but you have to be okay with the fact that maybe that wasn't going to be your audience anyway.
Right. Yeah, I completely agree. And I think that ties back to the idea of specializing is a little bit like picking a fight, because you're going to have some people, maybe they're old clients, maybe they're new clients, that you're going to say, sorry, we're not a right fit. So I think that's just sort of done at a much bigger scale. Yeah, and I love everything DHH and Jason Fried have done. I think they're just, I pay attention when they say something, so that makes a lot of sense. And I love, what you brought up with Lemonade, and it sort of seems like there's, that so many companies are marred down and only focusing on stuff you can measure, as opposed to just thinking of these bigger signaling kind of like creative, whimsical projects that really like do move the needle, right? And then after the fact, all the consultants, all the gurus flooded and say, look at all this measurable impact that we've seen from this pink dipping paint campaign. But at the time, they're just like, let's just do this weird shit and hope it works, And I think, yeah. And what I've heard, from Scott Galloway and others is that I think that crowds are going to be the next signal. Like that's going to be like a show of forces if you can like safely get a crowd together for something, just something that simple,
Well, it's scary when, going back to what I was saying earlier about this idea of attribution and proving results. And to your point, it's like those types of risks are tough because they're much harder to ultimately attribute to the growth, to the sale. And if your job's on the line as an agency or as a marketer and your job is to show growth, like why would you take a risk like that? It's kind of, the idea of trying to hit a home run, but, striking out a lot of the times. That said, you need to be in a relationship with your clients where they trust you, and that those types of risks might not have immediate tangible gains, at least in the short term, but like they're going to be long-term ones. I just got into a conversation the other day with one of the executives at my team talking about whether we should hire someone for PR. And PR is a really tricky thing because PR isn't necessarily about driving conversions. PR is all about, brand awareness.
Right.
And positioning. And so that conversation, it's also tricky to identify, whether you're a big enough company to invest in something like that, where you can afford the risks without the specific metrics. So I think you're right. I think that needs to happen. I think we need better ways of measuring that more concretely, so it doesn't feel as much of a risk. But, the people who are willing to take that risk and doing it correctly are definitely benefiting from the results.
Right. And we do a lot of that at Sales Schema for our clients, like getting people on podcasts and digital publications and that sort of thing. And although it does move more slowly than other campaigns, what I wonder about is there like a direct response component to what would have in the past been referred to as PR that actually does allow it to move faster and be more attributable? Like if you, I don't know if you have something ready, but if you're on our show and you said, go here to get this thing, that would be a way to attribute what we're doing now, which I guess is kind of like PR, right?
Yeah. And I think that's part of the equation, right? I mean,
Right.
I think that consumers are complicated in the sense of like, that is part of a singular tactic that would show the results that you're trying to get, the ultimate results. Yeah. But I wonder how many people, it's almost like this butterfly effect situation. It's like how many people hear, when you came to my podcast, and then they share it with another person, they share it with another person, and then someone comes back and they check out Sales Schema and they ultimately become a customer of yours. Yeah. It's really hard to measure that. So I think it's both, right? Yeah. It's maybe to some extent those tactics, like I say, hey, go to buytraject.com to check out our software. And that's like, if we see free trials that come, from the show notes of, this podcast episode, that might validate the bigger strategy.
Yeah. That makes sense. And I like that because it's what I would usually say, which is that it's hard. It's all in the ether, right? It's harder to figure out. So that makes a lot of sense. And I think I find that when I say things like that, or when anyone says stuff like that coming from the marketing world, it's just like this breath of fresh air to people a lot of the time, because everyone's just so inundated by BS and, getting told that, I can tell you the perfect story for why this works and exactly what we did and exactly what happened and didn't happen, as opposed to just, injecting a fair amount of ambiguity, which is like really what we're up against all the time.
It's really interesting in that if you kind of bring that back to our current climate in the US and our relationship with facts, we're in such a weird place too, because on the one hand, people want proof. And then on the other hand, people are very easy to dismiss proof if it doesn't fit into their narrative.
Right.
So it kind of goes back to this idea of like, a lot of people just want to hear confirmation bias. They want to hear what they want to hear. And if you can tell them the story that they want to hear, which is a form of BS, and we also know that you can manipulate the facts to tell your story as well.
Right. Right. Exactly, and there's no shortage of ways to do that now with more information, as opposed to less. So there's no shortage of information. So with that, you're kind of getting towards the end of the time. I'd love to learn a little bit more about what you're working on now at Traject. Just what you have coming up, how you guys are working with agencies and that sort of thing.
Yeah, Traject's been a lot of fun. So basically, digital suite of marketing tools covers a range of marketing subjects. So we've got, Authority Labs Rank Tracker for SEO, tracking keywords on like Google, Bing, and Yahoo. We have Grade Us, which is review management for local SEO, generating reviews, which is really important to small businesses. Gather Up, which does customer experience, also does kind of NPS, so being able to get the sentiment of your customers, get reviews, but also improve your business via the feedback. Traject Social, which is a social media management tool. We actually just integrated with Canva for content creation. So it lets you kind of schedule your social media posts, but also generate really beautiful visual content for Twitter, Facebook, added TikTok. It's a bunch of tools. We have Sife, which is dashboarding. So being able to visualize all your KPIs in one dashboard, whether it's Google Analytics or Facebook ads. And then one of our new beta tools for product review management is Traject SKU for e-commerce, being able to monitor your reviews. The thread that unifies all the tools when it comes to agencies is the ability to white label pretty much all of the software. So it's a really interesting, dilemma or decision for agencies of whether you're going to use the software tools on behalf of your clients, or if you're going to white label it under your own brand and ultimately allow yourself to sell to more clients to potentially scale your agencies because you're giving them kind of control of the software to implement it. Or, kind of gating the software, which is, you could work on a smaller client base, but you're investing more of your own agency time and resources to, perform the marketing tactics and strategies on behalf of the clients.
Yeah. And do you see it trending one way or the other?
I think it really depends on the agency. I think that there are challenges and benefits for both. I think the benefits of the white label is an element of authority, the ability to help more customers. You can't charge as much, though, when you're not providing that specific one-to-one or doing it for you, if you're doing it more on a consultative level. Whereas, with doing work for your clients and not white labeling, you can charge a higher premium because you're doing all the work, but it's a lot harder to scale because there's only certain amount of time in the day. So I think both. It depends on the type of agency you want to run, right?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. That makes a lot of sense. So giving agencies more optionality regardless sounds like a good thing to do. So Garrett, how can people get in touch with you?
Well, if you want to find me, you can find me on Twitter, mostly at Garrett Sussman. You can find me on LinkedIn or on the website bytraject.com. That's bytraject.com. And happy to connect with people. Always open book. Love talking, marketing, and geeking out.
Awesome. Sounds good, man. Thanks again.
Awesome. Thanks, Dan.
Yeah, take care.